In 1922, British archaeologist Herbert Blundell Prism led an expedition through the of Larsa, an ancient city-state in Iraq. Beneath layers of sun-baked silt, they struck something solid, a four-sided clay prism, unassuming as an office paperweight. It stood just 8 inches tall, yet every inch of its surface was covered in dense, cuneiform script. All as it was, the timeline it carried was so vast, it challenged our entire of human history. This is the Blundell Prism, the most version of the Sumerian King List. It's an official index of every city and ruler that ever held power in Mesopotamia. It doesn't read like a dry government. It opens with a line that feels lifted from a fantasy. The kingship descended from heaven. The kingship was in Eridu. Mainstream archaeology tells us Eridu was one of the world's first cities, founded around 5400 BC. But if we actually do the math with what the Sumerians wrote on this prism, it makes no sense at all within our modern list. Claims the first king, Ululim, ruled 28,800 years. Successor, 36,000 years. Just the first 5 cities mentioned, 8 kings are said to have reigned for a combined of 241,200 years. Quarter of a million years covered by just names. To put that in perspective, 240,000 years ago, according to the standard evolutionary model, modern humans were barely a thing. We were supposed to be sharpening sticks, not maintaining complex bureaucratic lists in walled cities. When academics see numbers like this, they roll their eyes. Poetic exaggeration, mythological padding. Sure, I'm no Assyriologist, but if I told you I caught a fish this big and handed you a detailed, verified GPS log of every fishing spot I visited for the rest of the week, would you assume I lied about the first parts because the fish sounded too large? Here's the problem. As the list moves forward, these astronomical lifespans begin to drop. They fall from 30,000 years to 1,200, then to reigns of 30 or 40 years, lifespans we recognize today. Terrifying part? Same document that lists these impossibly kings also lists rulers we know were for fact real. We found their palaces, their inscriptions, tombs. Where does myth end and history begin? Did the Sumerians just decide to tell the truth halfway through the prism? Or are we missing something fundamental about the era they called the antediluvian age? If those 8 kings weren't just legends, who or what were they? To understand why the Sumerians recorded such numbers, we need to look at figures who defined the pre-flood era. These weren't just names on a page, they were the foundation of a civilization. The list begins in Eridu with Ululim, 28,000 acres, followed by Alalgar, 36,000. Kingship moved to Bad Tabira, the reign defying biology. Enmen-Luana ruled 43,200 years. Enmen-Gal-Ana, 8,800 years, and the shepherd Dumazid, 36,005, plus the 3 kings in Laurek, Sippar, and Shuruppak, ruled for nearly 250,000 years. In our current understanding, 40,000 years covers almost the entire Homo sapiens. Yet Sumerian scribes record numbers with the same matter-of-fact that used to track bushels of grain, planetary movements. This suggests a disciplined logic. Key lies in the Sumerian sexagesime, base 60, not base 10. It's why we still have 60 seconds in a minute, 360 degrees in a circle. In the King List, massive reigns are almost multiples of 60. Used units called the Sar, 3,600 years, the Nur, 600. Ululim's 28,800 years is exactly 8 Sars. Mainstream historians argue these numbers were symbolic. Scribes weren't recording literal years, but using large mathematical units to signal a ruler's divine greatness, saying a king was larger than life by giving him a mathematically perfect reign. In this view, the years are a code for status, not a measure of time. If I call a historic figure a giant among men, you don't go digging for an 11-foot skeleton. Even if we accept the symbolic argument, the math remains remarkably complex. Up the 8 pre-flood reigns, 241,002 years. Researchers have pointed out that these aren't random multiples of 60. They appear to sync with astronomical cycles, the precession of the equinoxes, slow wobble of Earth's axis, which take 25,920 years to complete one cycle. Why would a society that mainstream history was still developing urban life be blessed with 26,000-year astronomical cycles? It doesn't make sense unless they weren't recording myths. To even notice these patterns, you need of stable, meticulous observation. This leads to a more provocative perspective. King List might be a distorted memory of a twin high-functioning epoch that existed long before our standard records begin. Rather than literal immortality, some scholars suggest these reigns might represent entire dynasties or epochs, condensed into how we say the Victorian era, to cover decades of change. Sumerians might have preserved the line while removing the need for a 30,000-year-old human. The Sumerians themselves offered no such humor. They presented these figures as literal truth, right alongside the mundane details of canaling and tax collection. They believed their first kings had descended from heaven, a phrase that could imply an origin or simply an authority beyond the human. The transition at the end of this list is the jarring part. After the eighth king, the record hits a wall, a catastrophic event that supposedly wiped the site clean, a global flood that reset Sumerian entirely. If this were just a routine river flood, why did it mark the absolute end of an era defined by 28,000-year reigns? Why did the greatness vanish along with the seas? On the Weld-Blundell prism, a long list of years and dates continues in orderly fashion till it stops abruptly. The next line is simple and direct. The flood swept over the land. Short phrase is a monumental divide, stating an era of legendary longevity from new, more fragile reality. For decades, academia dismissed this flood as a purely theological device. In 1929, Sir Leonard Woolley was pervading the Royal Cemetery at Ur when he had to dig deeper. Beneath the earliest known human burials, he had a clean 8-foot-thick layer of water-laid silt. No artifacts, no bones, no signs of life. Woolley realized that for a silt layer that to form, the entire valley must have been submerged under immense standing water for a significant civilization below the silt looked totally different from the one that built above. Other sterile layers have since been found at other Sumerian sites, like Shuruppak and Kish, often appearing directly above remains the Jemdet Nasser period, around 2900 BC. King List was recording a memory etched into the earth. Today, the scientific consensus suggests not a single global event, but a series of floods. Around 5,000 years ago, heavy glacial melt combined with extreme weather likely caused Tigris and Euphrates to burst their banks on a scale that would have covered the horizon. To a civilization living in a flat river, a flood that covers everything you see is, for all practical purposes, a global event. The Mesopotamian account doesn't exist in a vacuum. It shares striking DNA with the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Genesis flood narrative. In the Sumerian version, the hero is Ziusudra. Babylonian, Utnapishtim, in Hebrew, Noah. Mechanics remain the same: divine warning, vessel, survival of a few to restart. The King List treats this reset with cold, illustrative tone, not focusing on the but on the political fallout. It explicitly states that after the water subsided, King had to descend from heaven a second. This is where the math becomes truly readable. Before the flood, kings ruled for 30,000 years. Immediately after, the numbers dive. The first post-flood king, Jushur, is credited 1,200 years. His successor, 960. For regional flood happened around 2900 BC. We have historically verified king just centuries later. Those 1,000-year reigns would push them back into an era where archaeology doesn't even support urban kingship. Why would the Sumerians record a decline so perfectly mimics a biological collapse?